The third one, look down at Titus 2. Let's go back to Titus 2 and verse 3 at the next part, the third element, not given to much wine. The third godly characteristic Paul focuses upon is the self-controlled moderation that should characterize women of every age in Christ's church. Not given to much wine. I mean, that almost jumps off the page like, what's that there for? I mean, in our culture, we say, well, that shouldn't even be in there. They shouldn't even be, around drinking. But Paul was talking to a culture where drinking was a part of the culture, the biblical world. And spirit-controlled people are spirit-controlled in every part of their life. They resist excess in any area of their daily life. They're not slaves to any substance, be it wine or anything else. They're not slaves to any amusement. They're not slaves to anything. They have an attitude that they want to have every part of their life under the gracious lordship of Christ. They want every part of their life to please their master. So they're not given to much anything. Actually, the word is very strong. Not enslaved to wine. Not enslaved to something outside that can control you on the inside. Not enslaved to that. It's a very strong word. Most women in the early church were formerly pagans. Drunkenness was the norm for many women in that society. Drinking was the best way to forget about the problems of being a slave to some pagan man. A man who looked on his wife merely as a convenience to bear him legitimate children, to enhance his reputation in the community. Because of that lifestyle, because of that culture, women were basically hopeless. And so, especially in Crete, the older women were known to be just heavy drinkers because they just drank to kind of drown out the pain of life. They were enslaved. Paul said prior to their salvation, they were without hope, without God, to the saints in Ephesus. It wasn't any different across the ancient world. Coming to Christ changed everything, but old habits are hard to break. These women, these godly older women, they were saved and they were in the church and they were learning this reverent behavior. But every time problems came up, he says, you may not be enslaved to that. You may not go back to that old habit you had. The old pains from emotional and physical abuse would resurface, and the temptation to slip back into the intemperance of slavery to wine would grow strong. But lack of physical control of any appetite points to a spiritual immaturity. Both Timothy and Titus were told to beware of women returning to their old habits in the realm of drinking. And though that might not be on the front burner of most of your lives today, it might be on some, but not on most. The principle has not changed. Don't be enslaved to anything. Today, not given to wine goes far beyond merely wine. There's so many forms of alcohol never imagined in the biblical times that can be abused. Then there are drugs, both the acceptable ones, the prescription ones that can easily become something to be enslaved to, as well as the non-acceptable kinds. They can be abused. Tobacco can be abused. People can become enslaved to tobacco. Wonderful varieties of food can be abused. I mean, look at our culture. You ever seen the photo essay that New York Times recently did? They took backward shots of Americans in restaurants. And the chair is this wide, and the Americans were this wide. And bar stools this wide. And they talked about America is the most over-enslaved to eating nation on the planet. Don't be enslaved to anything. Whether it's the wonderful varieties of food that can be abused, the beautiful varieties of fashionable clothing that change with every season. I mean, Americans are enslaved to fashion, as is the rest of the world. All of these can be abused. They can become addictions. There's a generation of believers who've never tasted a drop of alcohol and pride themselves in that choice. That's us. Never touched a drop, proud that we haven't. And yet, we overeat with daily regularity, and both are condemned by God in Proverbs 23, verses 19 to 21, side by side. God equally condemns the drunkard and the gluttonous. Just like that. Like, he doesn't even take a breath between them. He says they're both vile in my sight. Terrible. We should be cautious. Because of Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8, we see that though the Bible never forbids wine drinking, our liberty is limited by the consciences of other believers and our testimony to the world. The lesson of temperance should be consistency. We must be as cautious of any intemperance. We must not be given to or enslaved to much of anything, be it the use of money, the enjoyment of leisure, the establishment of houses to live in. Whatever we do is to be tempered by the glory of God. He must be the object and focus of what we do. Remember what Paul concluded that whole section on questionable things with? Whether, therefore, you eat or drink, or whatever you do. So there you covered everything. Eat, drink, or anything else in between. Do all what? For the glory of God. It's just like that slander thing. I want to be the oracle of God. I want to glorify Him by what I say. I want the reverent behavior like a priest. I want to glorify God. Therefore, I'm not going to allow my life to become enslaved to anything that doesn't magnify and glorify Him. Modern society has elevated fashion to almost a point of idolatry. So that's another thing that the godly older women need to be teaching the godly younger women. Be careful about the idolatry of clothing. Clothing stores and newspapers and magazines, advertising and television commercials are like giant billboards that continually proclaim, we covet clothing. And if you don't have that clothing, you're nothing. And if you don't look like that, you're nothing. Expensive, often ostentatious jewelry for both men and women are becoming more and more prevalent as more and more flaunt their material prosperity and glorify themselves. We are continually goaded to put our bodies and our apparel on parade. Godly, older women don't do that. There is no given to enslavement by excesses of in their lives. They're not perfect. How do they do this? Well, look at verse 11 and 12. The grace of God that brings salvation. So when you and I get saved, God's grace operative in our lives accomplishes the second element, verse 12. Look at that. Teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly. It's the grace of God. When the older women launch into this mentoring ministry, they are not doing it in their own energy. They're not saying, oh, I hope I can hold on, and keep up this lifestyle. It is an internal transformation that the Spirit of God, through the grace of God, produces in our lives. It starts with salvation. The grace of God, verse 11, that brings salvation. Verse 12, for those who are saved, they have the power to deny ungodliness. It's the grace of God inside of born-again people that teaches us to deny ungodliness. And a godly older woman is a spirit-controlled woman in every part of their life. They resist excess in any area of their daily life. They are not slaves to any substance, any amusement, any fashion, or any attitude that does not please their master in heaven. Godly women are reverent in behavior. They live like priests for God. They're not slanderers. They have guarded tongues. They are not given to much wine. They have no excesses. Godly women seek to be reverent in their behavior, careful in their conversations, and never enslaved to anything but Christ.